Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Leslie Cordy. I am the Director at Large for AAACE, and I see that Alan Knox has joined us at this moment. I am going to give you some information just about the technology piece. If you are online, we are glad to see you. We like to see those smiling faces out there, and we do like to hear you, but when you are not speaking, could you please make sure that you are muted or your mic is muted? We have a chat box that can be used to post questions, but if our speaker goes ahead and addresses a question to you, you are free to participate as appropriate. And if you have any questions or concerns about the technologies and things, you can talk with either myself, Leslie Cordy, or Terry Doherty from AAACE. But we do have Dr. John Holst with us this morning, and I'm wondering if Dr. Alan Knox would like to, if he can make that introduction. We'll see if he can speak with us. I can see that we have lots of folks from all around the world with us. I see a few of my wonderful Irish folks who have joined us this morning. Yay! Or this afternoon. Okay. I think Alan is having some trouble, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Holst and get John on his way. We're lucky to have him with us this morning to talk about the multiple issues facing our societies today and how adult education can have a critical conversation around that. There were some questions that you were to think about in terms of this forum, which were the how do you see evidence of the social crisis in your personal and professional life? What kinds of movements do you see emerging around these crises? And how can your professional practice be oriented to serve and advance these moments? But Dr. John Holst, he began working in adult education a few years ago in the late 1980s in Illinois, and he served a variety of positions in the profession as an adult educator, adult basic educator, and worked in some different colleges. He decided to pursue his graduate degree at Northern Illinois University, and he was working at the School of Education at the University of St. Thomas, which some of you know very well, in Minnesota, for over 17 years before going to Penn State University in 2017. His research does focus on case studies and the theoretical foundations of adult education in terms of social change, and he's the author of several wonderful publications, including Social Movements, Civil Society, and Radical Adult Education. So welcome, John, and we'll turn over the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'll be sharing my screen in a moment, but I thought maybe I'd just start. I wanted to thank Terry and Leslie and Alan for working to set this up and for the invitation to be a part of this. It's really an honor for me. I also wanted to thank Larry Martin and Simone Conceição and Alan again as editors of the Compendium and asking me to contribute to that. And the presentation today is based on my contribution to the Compendium. So I'll just jump right into it. I do have a PowerPoint. It has a few embedded videos in it of some examples of social movements. Hopefully that'll be good. It won't be a technological meltdown, but we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to share my screen. I think the presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then the rest of the time for discussion. So I'll share the screen. So the title, Mission and Vision of Adult Education in Turbulent Times. I have 4 major points that I want to make in this presentation. The first one, we live in a period of growing polarization. We also live in a period of growing social movements. And the most innovative and powerful movements, I think, are those rooted in social sectors most impacted by polarization. And towards the end, this might be one of the more confusing aspects, but I want to make the argument that these are actually revolutionary social subjects. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as the presentation moves on. And I think the demands of these growing movements point to a vision of what a socially just society can look like. And I also want to pose one major challenge, and maybe in a couple of different ways, but can we put our knowledge and skills as adult educators to the service of social movements as they fight for social change? So on the notion of polarization, here's a list of facts in terms of just some elements of the way polarization is playing out. I think many of these you're probably familiar with. They come up even in mainstream media, but the growing wealth polarization and the creation of the super rich, I think that gets a certain amount of mainstream news. The third point there, that 60% of the world's employed population, which is about 2 billion people, now work in the impoverished informal sector. In other words, they do not have standard work contracts as we would understand them. Moreover, the global unemployed or precariously employed, some people refer to this as the reserve army of labor, but unemployed or very precariously sometimes employed labor force is 2.4 billion people. It's 70% larger than the active labor force in the world today. Healthcare, housing, clean water, and air are increasingly out of the reach of growing sectors of societies around the world. Growing homelessness, life expectancy on the decline, this reemergence of what we would think of as sort of Victorian age illnesses, scurvy, tuberculosis, the growing physical and sexual violence experienced by women around the world, the growing migration crisis, growing crisis of hunger around the world. I think these are just some examples of what we're seeing in terms of polarization today. And movements, and I think the most dynamic movements that we see today are those that emerge from sectors most impacted by polarization. And here's just a few examples. So this is the video portion of the presentation. Oops.
On Facebook because I wanted everyone in the world to know that no matter how much the police tamper with evidence, how much they stick together, no matter how they manipulate, put it on Facebook and go viral so that the people could see it. So that the people could see. I wanted the people to determine who was right and who was wrong. I want the people to be the testimonies here. All of us saw with our eyes. Only thing you guys didn't see is when he shot. And if I would have moved while that gun was out, he would have shot me. So I chose to allow the video to go live 10 seconds before my phone died because I wanted everybody in the world to see what the police do and how they roll. And it's not right. It's not acceptable. I didn't do it for pity. I didn't do it for fame. I did it so that the world knows that these police are not here to protect us. They are here to assassinate us. They are here to kill us because we are black.
Here's another example from the fight for the 15 movement among low-wage workers. Oops.
That's not going to be that dramatic an increase.
Of course not. $15, if you guys see it like it's a lot, it's not. $15 is, it's just a way for me to stop crying every day that I can't pay my rent, crying that I can't buy them a pair of shoes. It's just an equivalent of being able to survive.
Here's another example from struggles among low-wage workers. This is from the Twin Cities in St. Paul, Minnesota.
6 years ago, when we started this campaign, we started organizing to ensure a voice on the job for retail janitors. We were told that the industry was impossible to organize. This was a fractured, subcontracted industry where the fierce competition amongst the janitorial companies led to a race to the bottom for workers and a larger and larger concentration of wealth for the retailers at the top who were benefiting off of this competition. Despite these enormous obstacles, Setulo and retail janitors organized, stood up, fought, and won. Workers sacrificing time away from their families, risking their livelihood by standing up to their bosses in the face of retaliation. Workers have done the impossible. So we're proud to announce today that the Twin Cities has become the first major metropolitan area in the country where the retail janitorial industry is now union.
Here's another example of international efforts at international solidarity among low-wage workers.
I'm Julie Hill, and I'm a human rights activist and lawyer out of Greenville, Mississippi, which is in the Delta region, the poorest region in the country, where the poverty level is 46%. Mississippi is number 50 in education and in economics. And so we're here to underscore the plight of low-wage African-American workers in the state of Mississippi and the jobless in the state of Mississippi. And the children who are born into poverty every day in the state, and to make the connection between those local struggles and our international struggles. We are part of a global community of citizens who have been historically locked down, historically pushed to the back, ignored, and oppressed by these very forces and structures that are meeting right now as we speak. They're meeting to make decisions about our lives. They're meeting to trade us as commodities and property, just as they traded Africans 400 years ago when they brought them to this country in chains. The conditions are rolling back to that. Many workers working under conditions that are similar to those under the brutal system of slavery. And so from the fields where farm workers work, whether it's the Coalition of Immokalee Workers or Mississippi Catfish Workers, it's the same struggle, the same fight.
Access to water is also another survival issue. Here's a couple of examples around that.
My son and I decided that we had had enough of the water problems in Highland Park, and this is when I started talking to people. I started talking to Marion. I started talking to Maureen. This is how the Highland Park Human Rights Coalition was formed.
The 9-month bill was how much?
Yeah, that was the 9-month bill. You know, we're losing out on everything. On one of the water, we have. We're losing out with the people, okay? They want to turn our water system over to a private corporation. What I feel has happened is that all of you have become friends and you have forgotten about the business of this city.
We need to do something that gives our folks an opportunity to get back on tap with their with their water needs and to move this city forward. Now you can talk what you want to. You came up with no proposal.
You are lying. No, Miss Johnson, nothing. We did come up with one. He has it in his pack. Nobody wanted to listen to what he had to say. Don't lie, don't lie, don't lie. Do not lie.
This water issue is so profound. I had no idea that we would be engaged in this horrific fight to have water recognized as a human right.
Here's one more example in terms of water.
Can I ask you why you're out here today?
We're here for the protection of our water. We're here for a way of life. We're here for the unborn. We're here for the generations coming behind us. It's pretty sad that we have to do this. But there's powers greater than this pipeline. There's powers that's greater than anything that this money represents. So we believe in our prayer. They tell us this. The non-native people say, seeing is believing. As Lakota, we say, believing is seeing. So it will stop, it won't connect. That's our belief. That's why we're here.
So I think it's important to sort of think theoretically a bit in terms of understanding these new movements that are emerging and the moment that we're living in. As I was mentioning earlier, 2.4 billion people, and it's a growing sector of humanity across the planet, are basically superfluous to the basic relationship of capitalism. In other words, you get a job to get a wage, to get some money to buy the things you need, and that's how we produce and distribute things in a capitalist society. And yet, there's a growing sector of the human species that's increasingly outside the basic relationship of capitalism, which means that we're in a revolutionary epoch because there's an objectively revolutionary subject, a whole sector of society that's forming and growing among us that's outside that basic relationship. It's a revolutionary subject because it cannot survive within the prevailing relations of production and distribution under a capitalist society. Outside these prevailing relationships of production and distribution, this growing sector of society must have distribution based on need and not ability to pay. Therefore, socialism moves from a utopian dream to a practical resolution of a growing problem for a growing sector of the species across the planet. So, in terms of adult education and social change, we know we have quite a bit of research in terms of what we now call frequently social movement learning, that learning is central to social change. I would like to add to that, though, that education is central as well. Movements have educators, and I think we need more studies in terms of who those educators are, what their educational practices and theory is, and movements need educators. And social movement educators themselves, like all educators, need to be educated. And vision, I think, is central to the education of movement educators. So, what contributions can we make to create transformative organizers and to create transformation as adult educators? Do we as a field have what movements need? Are we prepared, and can we prepare others for these growing movements and the moment that we're living in today? Just to sort of get the ball rolling here, the 7 attributes of transformative organizers is from a recent, I guess you would call it a movement text that was put out called When We Fight, We Win, drawing together social movement activists from various social movements. And they came up with these 7 points in terms of what the attributes of transformative organizers are. The first one, build organizations that are grounded in the most impacted communities. Well, a lot of adult education students come from these impacted communities, and many adult educators work in those communities. So I think there's affinities there. Transformative organizers create transformative visions. Well, we even have a whole journal on and conferences on transformative education. I think there's space there for collaboration. Transformative organizers tell powerful stories. We're a field steeped in qualitative research. That's what we do. Our research should tell powerful stories. I think we have methodological practices that can be of service to movements to tell powerful stories. Transformative organizers go to the root causes of problems. The radical adult education tradition, radical, means to get to the root causes. So I think there too, there's areas for collaboration. Reclaim the intersection of our struggles and identities. I think the best of our theory and practice works along theories of intersectionality. So I think there's areas for collaboration there. Disrupt power, changing who has it and what to do with it once it is claimed is an attribute of transformative organizers. Power is a concept that we work with frequently in our research. And I think we can bring theories of power to social movements and dialogue around them. Build solidarity and stand together. Paulo Freire's concept of conscientization is about seeing the interconnectedness of people's reality. So I think there too, there's areas for collaboration. So that's the presentation portion of my talk today. So I'd like to open it up for questions and discussion at this point.
Well, thank you, John. That was some powerful video and some information that I think we're probably all digesting. I'm sure that some of you have some comments out there or some thoughts about the presentation. I am somewhat familiar with the water issues in terms of Detroit, Michigan, right? And some of the issues that have happened there. I wasn't aware that it was also costing them money. I knew that there was a scarcity of water and the water was bad. So thank you for sharing that. That was something very interesting. I have a couple questions out there now. One is from Carol Shaw. If the movements are coming out of polarized places, how can they educate people without being labeled fake news and being dismissed?
Oh, tough question. Good. Start out with a hard one. I mean, I think the movements that are, for me, the movements that are most dynamic are from sectors that are those experiencing polarization the most. I think in a sense, successful movements overcome those issues. So for example, I think the Fight for the 15 movement, I think, was really fascinating, and it was interesting because having been in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and there was the short video I showed about the retail workers. That organization, it's called CTUL, which it's in Spanish, and it's the Center for Center for Workers United in Struggle is the way you would translate the title of the organization. And they were very early on involved in the minimum wage fight. And I remember, well, and I'm probably we all probably remember this to the extent that we were following this, but that movement, I mean, it was considered absolutely ridiculous. I mean, when people were beginning to propose this notion of a $15 minimum wage, they were laughed at, dismissed, like, this is just, I mean, you're nuts. I mean, there's no way this is ever going to happen. And yet, by building coalitions, building that movement, they changed the, as people call it today, they changed the narrative. And now people are serious. I mean, I probably should have had the figures, but I mean, there's a significant segment of the country now that has, and a growing segment that has $15 an hour minimum wage standards. So, for example, in the Twin Cities, both Minneapolis and St. Paul passed $15 minimum wage ordinances, and it's even being put out on the national stage too. So, I mean, I think at least that would be my sort of initial way of addressing that question. Is I think the successful movements are able to sort of win the battle of ideas, if you as a way of phrasing it, of sort of changing the dynamic of how the issues are talked about, and can change the conversation. So, but yeah, I mean, in that, I think it is pretty common that, initially a lot of times movements are dismissed, and that's, part of the battle around who's setting the agenda.
Okay. All right. So building on that then, John, a lot of us are educators or instructors or things like that. So do you think that we should, to go into those spaces, how do we go into those movement spaces? Do we start with our classes and the students that we already serve? Or how would you suggest we enter into those spaces to help those movements?
I mean, I think there's, multiple things we can do. I mean, it also depends on, I think it depends on who you work with and where you work. So, for example, when I was in the Twin Cities, there was a lot of dynamic social movement activity going on. And so it wasn't that hard to, for example, in teaching graduate level courses, to bring in activists from social movements. That was really quite easy to do, who were on the ground in the area working on those movements. And I think students my experience was students would get really interested in thinking about the educational work that these movements do, and how as educators we can hook up with that. I think with our research, I think we can do research on social movements, and work with movements in terms of doing research. Here at Penn State, for example, we're slowly working on the process. We want to create a Center for Social Movements in Education. And so we're hoping to both be researchers of and with social movements, and also hopefully can do workshops and trainings and stuff with social movement activists. So I think, it depends a little bit on, where you're at and who you're working with. But I think there's a lot of different ways people can engage these movements.
I have another couple questions, but Matt, go ahead and ask your question yourself, please.
Thanks. Hey, John. This is Matt in New Orleans. I definitely agree and understand the dynamism of the movements that you're talking about. I don't quite understand what is different that you're calling polarization. Could you say something about that? Thank you.
Yeah. A couple of things on that. Polarization, I think polarization is a way to I'll get a little theoretical here for a moment, but hopefully not too long. And if I stop me when I polarization, I think, is sort of the way we experience growing contradictions of a political economic nature. And I've written a little bit about this, and drawing on sort of organic intellectuals from social movements and other social science scholars as well. But it seems to me that the reality of a growing sector of society outside the prevailing relationships of capitalism, to me, marks that we are entering a new epoch in society, that new technologies and implementations of new technologies, and I don't want to overplay this, but I don't want to underplay it either, because there's a lot of, and there's been for a while, a lot of stuff on, the end of work and the robots are coming and we're all going to be replaced by robots, and some of it's a little overplayed. But I think there's a general tendency in that new technologies today are not just labor-saving technologies that we've seen in, say, the last 100 years or so, but they're actually labor-replacing technologies. And that plays out, I think, in different ways. But I do think what we're seeing is the growing replacement of labor by technology in areas, and then the growing fragmentation of employment across the world. So that's this huge emergence of an informal sector, and it's an informal sector now that is really displaced from any alternative ways of accessing the things folks need to survive on a daily basis. So that polarization is the experience of those growing contradictions in capitalism. Therefore, I think the movements that we see today are expressions of how those economic contradictions play out in a social and political level. So
that's great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Thanks for putting the brakes on me there.
All right. I have a couple other questions. Dr. Knox, did you want to say something? You are still muted, Dr. Knox. No, now you're muted now again. I'm going to go ahead and ask another question, and you can come in on the next. I see another curriculum issue, John, about how we could effectively incorporate relevant social issues into a curriculum that is sort of regulated by an agency or a government. How can we do that without making it seem like we're preaching?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I like that one. Yeah, I always, well, I guess it's been in the last few years, but I always say when there's a couple of students here of mine, so they can say, no, that's not true. But I always say, I'm a teacher, not a preacher. And so I don't do politics in the classroom. I do science in the classroom. And I think that in terms of graduate level adult education, I think what we need to produce scientists, critical scientists. And so I think inevitably in classes in adult education, I think we deal with political issues. But for me, I begin with the idea that reality itself is revolutionary. So I don't need to speak with fiery revolutionary rhetoric in my classroom. A critical, robust, interdisciplinary analysis of society, to me, leads to the conclusions that I'm putting forth today. So, this notion that's clearly could be articulated or labeled as a highly political statement, that socialism today is not a utopian dream, but is merely a practical resolution of problems faced by millions, billions of people across the planet. To me, that's a conclusion drawn from a robust analysis of society. So when you've got 2.4 billion people who are basically outside the prevailing relationship of ability to get a job, to buy the things they need to survive, that's a human rights issue. So that for them to be able to survive, they need distribution based on need and not ability to pay, which is socialism. I don't put that forth as sort of obviously it's thinking about solving social issues, but coming to that conclusion, it's not from reading the Communist Manifesto or whatever. It's from an analysis of reality today and how we can solve those problems. So, I think that just studying reality itself lends itself to the emergence of really dicey issues that need quite radical solutions, but that don't necessarily need to be posed in, fiery speeches and pontificating and citing, revolutionary thinkers. So.
All right, so building on that then too, Jane had a question earlier about root causes and transformative visions, especially in the context of tribalism. So how would you, and I think she's including the audience too, how would you characterize transformative visions for our field?
And I get in tribalism, I guess, in the sense of sort of splintering into sort of social interest groups or things like that, and people being isolated and just among those who sort of think like they do. I'm assuming that's sort of the notion of tribalism. So I'll just sort of go from there. I think movements that I think are successful, and the movements that sort of I highlighted in the videos, and there's many more, they themselves seek out allies, if you want to use that term, those in common situations. So I thought, the excerpt from the woman that works with the Miss Jeruba Hill, who works with the Mississippi catfish workers. So that was at a coalition that had formed in Miami that involved organizations among women, among farm workers, janitorial work. It was a multi-issue, multi sector coalition that was actually fighting around global justice issues and issues around fair trade and free trade and those sorts of issues. So I think those movements provide us lessons in terms of how people seek out allies and build broader coalitions. And I think in a certain sense, polarization is leading to creating objective conditions that make those coalitions more feasible. Because there's one thing is to think about that, to understand it as a necessity, and then another thing is, well, are there people in social sectors who are actually experiencing objectively similar situations? And it seems to me that this growing sector of society I'm talking about is a sector of society that cuts across sort of all the major divisions that we see, at least speak in terms of the US context, that speak against the divisions that sort of have traditionally divided us in the US. And so there's both the objective conditions, and then I think there's movements that have sort of sought out those coalitions that provide examples of that.
All right, I think Fergal has something for us. You're muted. There you go.
How are you getting on? Good. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. When I saw the title of the talk today, I was very excited actually, because I think it's the type of proposals you're making are really important for adult education. Now, it's not like we haven't had a focus on emancipatory social movements before. We have. But my experience in Ireland and in Europe is that that's weakened for various reasons. The organic connection between movements and the field is weakened. And I think that creates a certain difficulty. I completely agree with you about everything you're saying, but actually how those of us within academic institutions and those of us who are practitioners and those of us who are working on a policy level, how is it that we can rebuild an organic connection to social movements? I think that's one big problem, and you might want to speak to that. The other thing is, I think there might be a ripening of the time. There's certainly a social ferment going on, but I think the tasks of radical adult educators has been complicated by changes in the way actual capitalism works. Its speed, its power, its complexity, and the sort of time frame we're working within to deal with the ecological crisis. So I think it's necessary to supplement that sort of very optimistic vision you have with a real engagement with the complexities of what we're dealing with, and I think returning a bit to political economy. So those are comments for what they're worth, and if people want to speak about how this relates to Ireland, I'm happy to do that later.
Those are very good points. Thank you. And I do think so the first one, the complexities, yeah, I agree. I do think political economy is really important. I think in a certain way we've gotten away from that in the field, although perhaps it's sort of reemerging in certain ways. But I would insist that a political economic understanding of, and a political economic understanding, I don't mean just economics, but I mean the interplay of the social, political, and economic, all understood as sort of a complete package, so to speak. But I do think the changing nature of capitalism as a social reality, and understanding that, and I'm presenting sort of thumbnail sketches of an analysis that, and I wasn't trained as an economist, but most trained economists can't explain the economy anyway, so I don't worry too much about that. I do think that's really, really key. The disconnect between sort of social movements in the field, and perhaps a little bit more on sort of the European and Irish context I would appreciate that. In the U.S., I think that's taken place, and I think it's tied up to, how sort of the field has evolved and has been challenged over time. I'm sort of hopeful that we still have pockets of folks, and hopefully we can build on that. I think the Canadians, I'm always impressed with I look at the CASI programs, and it's like, oh my God, there's like 15 presentations on something to do with social movements and adult education. It's amazing. And I look at the AERC ones, I'm like, there's 3 or 4. Okay, that's all right. Well, it's something to build on. So, I mean, that's a reality. It's hard to answer that question. I mean, I do think that, coursework on that, like I said, what we're trying to do at Penn State, I'm trying to build a group of graduate students and faculty that's really pursuing social movements and adult education. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, perhaps building a community of practice, John, in terms of connecting with some of these folks right here, right now, and others, right, in terms of developing that, and building with CASI, who is a partner with AAACE. So that's something, I think it now is a good time in terms of what's happening, as Matt asked, what was different, right? And I think that we know that there are some things that are very different. So let's see if Alan can say anything. We still can't hear you, Alan. I'm wondering if your headset is still plugged in and that's with your speaker, or perhaps. And so we'll try one more time. Let's see if that works. Maybe it was doing that. I think while we're doing that, John, what would you say to all of us as we leave this webinar? What might be something for us to reflect on, do, or perhaps read?
Wow, okay. I could
Besides your book, of course.
For my own books, but I won't do that. I personally, I try to read newspapers, documents that social movements produce themselves. I mean, there are sort of, and I am talking about sort of progressive, left-wing social movements here. I mean, there's the whole topic of right-wing movements, and in that. So I try to do that. I mean, I try to be, as connected as I can be to what social movements themselves are producing. So I mean, there's tons. I don't do Facebook that much, but I know there's tons of stuff on Facebook and websites and movements that put out their own literature, like that book I mentioned. When we fight, we win. And I find that movements in the literature that movements and movement organizations put out is really sophisticated. I read stuff and I think, my God, this was a newspaper put out by a social movement organization. It was like, it's a 6 or 7 page newspaper, and I feel like I've gone through a graduate seminar on theories of change and analyses of the contemporary period. So I think to the extent that you can read materials produced by social movement organizations themselves, I think it's, and then you can incorporate that into coursework to the extent that's appropriate and at level given where you're at, where you're working. So
right, and Virgil has reminded me that we have the AEGT 2020 conference where Ezraya, Skatreya, Kasai, AAACE, AERC, and the Australian Learning Association, and perhaps a few others are all going to be meeting together in May of 2020, or early June, I believe, of 2020. So that's another opportunity for you to meet on this topic and to work collaboratively together. So thank you for that, Virgil.
John?
Yes?
Could you provide some examples from your experience and other educators of adults who have worked with students or work with workshop participants who are already engaged in specific social movements, and work with them regarding ways in which they can provide more effective leadership within the networks and the connections that they already have?
I mean, my own work, I've worked, so like when the Occupy movement was going on, there was, Stephen and I with the work on radicalizing learning. There were folks who were contacting us from different places, and so we were engaged in some fairly informal, really. Stephen, I think, did a little bit more in New York, some informal discussions with folks who were using that text as a study text. So I think connecting with movements, working with student in graduate education where I'm at now, getting students who are doing their research on social movements, both historically and contemporary. I think that, I've that's been an experience I've had. So I think that's, because it seems to me there's so much to be studied, and not just for study's sake, but for enriching the field of adult education, and then also if it can be in collaboration of working with different movements. So I've, some of the case study work I've done with different organizations and sort of kept contact with them in terms of highlighting the different types of social movement educational work that takes place. And I think, like I was saying, here at Penn State, and we're hoping that that's something that's going to come out of the work that we're starting to do here, because we have a sort of now a core of faculty who are interested in doing social movement research. So, doing the work yourself, getting students to research social movements. So I'm teaching a class right now on globalization and lifelong learning. And so we spend the first half of the class on colonialism and post-colonial theory as sort of the historic origins of globalization. And I'm like harping on the students all the time. There's so many movements that emerged out of the sort of era of anti-colonial and national liberation struggles that have not been studied for the rich pedagogical practices and theory that they produced. I mean, it's just amazing, I think. all that could be done there in terms of rescuing that, reviving that, seeing what's still of utility in terms of that period and our period today. So,
okay.
It sounds as though there's a two-step process, and that is that educators of adults who are very interested in the research and the theory and the symptoms of problems that warrant movement and activities is one step. But then there's another step of people who are already immersed in those movements and ways in which they can be helped to be more effective in that role. Is that accurate? It sounds like your presentation has to do with consciousness raising and research on the one hand, but other people are involved in the front lines of social movements. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for saying that. Way better than I could have ever done. Yeah, I remember I wrote about this and I can't remember where, but in the Twin Cities, I used to have Nelson Peary, who was a longtime revolutionary social movement activist who was based in Chicago for a number of years, was originally from Minnesota. And he used to come into the class, and the students, they always wanted to ask him. They were all educators, higher educators, teachers, K-12 and some adult educators. They always wanted to ask him, tell us how we should teach. And he would say, you guys, he would say, I'm a revolutionary. I know revolutionary theory. You're the teachers. You need to tell me how to be a better teacher in revolutionary organizations. And I always thought, boy, that was really great, because he really, he put it upon us, and so what are the skills that we have as educators, and how can we in a give and take, in a collaborative way, work with movements to provide the skills that we have, that we've developed as a field. I think that's really, really important. So, that means then connecting with those organizations and figuring out.
Okay, before I let you go again, Alan, there's like 2 minutes to go, so right. I'm gonna give some concluding remarks and things. That this information will be available and posted at the AAACE website under the Compendium, which Dr. Knox will talk a little bit about next. We want to thank John for his time, and thank you all for participating. I know that Neve, is that how you say your name? Neve, yes, posted something related to something that was just posted on adult learning policy and the future of work, which John alluded to, so that might be something very interesting for you to look at. So with that, if you need to go, you may go, but Dr. Knox, I'll let you have some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks, John, very much. For those of you who have participated in some of the 4 virtual forum sessions during 2018, may recall that in September, the session with Laura-Lee Sandman and Karen Watkins was on action research in relation to engaged community groups. And many of the things that they talked about there dealt with that bridge between the university's role and the role of people in the local communities who are dealing with the specific issues that are involved. So that's just a comment about the past series. As Leslie has already indicated, the website, the AAACE and Silas website, lists the 4 remaining virtual forum sessions for this year. And so I would call your attention to those. In each of those instances, there are authors of Compendium articles in the past that may be of interest, and an opportunity during the hour to discuss with people who register as all of you have for this session with the author, John in this instance, and each other about the topics that were involved. So thank you all very much, and we look forward 2 months from now for the second of the 5 during 2019. Thank you all.
Okay. So all of that information is posted at the AAACE website. We thank you, Dr. Holst, for being with us. If there are any follow-on questions, I know that they probably could contact you. You have a list of all the participants. And thank you again for joining us for this very, very thoughtful webinar. Have a good day.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.